we're going to take a look at Piers Morgan's interview with Wesley Huff, a biblical historian, where they talk about the historical accuracy of the existence of Jesus Christ and, most importantly, the truth of the resurrection.
Is it indisputable to you that Jesus Christ existed, for example?
Oh, definitely so. I think we can say pretty unequivocally that a character, a first century Jewish itinerant rabbi by the name of Jesus of Nazareth, did walk the dusty streets of first century Roman occupied Judea. I think that even the most skeptical scholars will grant that if we know very little about Jesus, we know that he did exist and that he was crucified in and around the beginning of the first century under the overseeing of the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate.
I want to play you a clip from one of my friends, Jordan Peterson, who's very skeptical about all this. And he said this.
Profound religious account is bottomless. Mm-hmm. And the biblical representations are like that. There's no limit to the amount of investigation they can bear, not least because the text itself is deeply cross-referenced. So there's an innumerable number of paths through it. It's like a chessboard. And so it's inexhaustible in its interpretive space.
That's true.
What do you say to that, Wesley?
Yeah, it's interesting, Piers. I really appreciate Jordan Peterson and kind of the angle that he reveals on the biblical text and some of the kind of allegorical perspectives that it reveals. I don't deny that in the least. In fact, I think I've found Peterson very helpful in his Jungian approach in drawing some of those things out, whereas maybe prior to finding Jordan Peterson, I might have dismissed them in a way that I think was probably too soon to do so. However, I think two things can be true at the exact same time, Piers. I think we can grant that there is meaning that goes beyond the text, but not deny that there were actual events that took place, that people like Jordan Peterson talk about from the biblical narratives, individuals at the core, like Jesus Christ, actually existed, actually walked this world, did predict his own death and resurrection. And then if you could have a camera running on the tomb in and around 33 AD, that an actual Jesus would have walked out on the third day after his crucifixion and burial.
See, that is the crux of this, isn't it? Is that whether Jesus of Nazareth was resurrected really goes to the absolute essence and heart of Christianity, because obviously if he was, then that is a miracle, and then everyone that believes in Christianity and what it all stands for and Jesus and everything would feel validated by the fact, well, how else do you explain it? So it's at the crux of it. From the text of the New Testament then, where is the actual hard evidence for you as an historian that actually happened?
Yeah, I think we do, Piers, have a historical question in terms of we have an actual character who we can demonstrate that lived, and then we have that same character being demonstrated in multiple independent and cross-reference sources, chief of which we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But just because those are religious texts now doesn't necessarily negate that they are historical texts. These were independent written sources that come from the time frame. If we want to know about someone from the ancient world or history in general, we go to the earliest sources, preferably eyewitness sources. And I think that's what we have within the Gospels. So we have a character who lived, who died, and then a character who was said by an early Jesus community to have been resurrected. And the accounts of that are not just kind of scant. They're not seeing Jesus off from afar as some sort of apparition or something like that. What we have is the case of instances of the early Jesus community saying they walked with him, they talked with him, they ate with him. And this happened over the course of, as Luke in his combination, the Gospel of Luke and Acts, says over the course of 40 days. This wasn't a short event. And so there were as many as, Paul says, up to 500 witnesses who took part in this event before his ultimate, resurrecting, going to the ascension of the right hand of the Father. And so it's a historical question, Piers, in the sense that we have to account for what is the best inference to the explanation of this particular thing happening. And I would contend that given the historical data that we can look at, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to explain this from a historical perspective. And that when we do so and we look at the independent testimonies that all intersect on this particular event, we actually, the best explanation to that is that this event actually did take place.
Well, there you go. It perfectly explains it. How do we prove the existence of Jesus? Well, you have the historical records of the Gospels, and not just that, from many other, let's say, non-religious and secular records from the Roman government of that time, and many other historians, such as the Jewish historian Josephus, which offered a crucial insight to what actually happened to the crucifixion and the existence of Jesus Christ. Now, you have the Gospels. The Gospels are obviously from the disciples of Jesus. So even though that is the most accurate account, just because of its closeness. Now, if someone was going to write a story about you, you want it to be from someone who is the closest to you, right? But looking at it historically, it can be biased. So you look at other sources that don't have any biases towards you, such as Josephus. Josephus is a Jewish historian, which is contradictory to the message of Jesus. So they won't have anything in common. As a matter of fact, they have conflicting interests. So they benefit none whatsoever by recording Jesus. So their accounts are completely separate from the accounts of the Gospels. Thirdly, you have the accounts from the Roman Empire, which includes the Annals of Tacitus, which mentions the crucifixion of Jesus Christ under the command of Pontius Pilate. So that within itself already has a free verifiable historical evidence of the accounts and accounts of what happened in that event, from the Gospels being the closest accounts to Jesus Christ, Josephus, the Jewish accounts of the event, and you also have Tacitus from the Roman aspects of it. Now that's all three main players and demographics of that time, from the Christian movement of Jesus to the Jewish religion reigning over that land, and the Roman account, which ruled over all at that time. So historically speaking, you have the complete account of every player involved.
Now, again, to play devil's advocate, the argument against it goes, look, all these witnesses were likely to have been pretty primitive, mostly illiterate people. Eyewitness testimony notoriously is unreliable. It's the least credible evidence in a courtroom these days, for example. And since the historical method doesn't deal with miracles, it's ridiculous, people say, to base any history on it. And even Matthew's gospel tells us when Jesus appeared in front of his 11 disciples, some of them doubted, to which people say, well, if even not all his disciples believe this, why on earth should we?
Yeah, I think there are a few things going on there. In terms of the historical method and how we actually evaluate things, we only have witness testimony. You know, you do have something that's very different than a courtroom in a modern legal setting, right? Even something like hearsay. Well, all of ancient history in one sense is hearsay, but that doesn't apply when we apply it to the historiographical method. We need to use the same standards that when we would look at something like, say, the biographies of Tiberius with Velleius Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassiodeo, when we have multiple instances of reporting on someone's life, we look at both the things that they agree on and the things maybe where they have a differentiation in detail, and then we try to the best of our ability explain some of the different instances that are going on. Now, I would say, you know, to the accusation, well, these are just ancient, illiterate people, that's what C.S. Lewis referred to as chronological snobbery. You know, just because people are ancient neither means they're stupid nor that they don't know what's going on. And what we have in terms of this event is really early on after Jesus's death, we have an explanation of what if the resurrection didn't take place, what we would expect. The 11 disciples are hiding in the upper room. They're scared. They're aware of other messianic movements in the ancient world. Individuals like Simon Bar Giora, who claimed to be the Messiah when his movement was squashed. So when he died, when he died, his movement was squashed. And so I think we have to look at, okay, what explains these 11 scared disciples then going on to not just proclaim that Jesus did rise from the dead, but actually went to the point of risking their lives in persecution. And some of them did die for that proclamation. And so I think it's not outside of the realm of possibility for history to actually be able to evaluate this evidence and say, okay, we have these questions. How then do we explain something like an empty tomb, or even Jesus's disciples go back and the account of the Pentecost happens in Jerusalem. So Jesus's disciples go back to the scene of the crime in the town where people would have saw him crucified, and now they're proclaiming he's resurrected. Well, why would you go back to the place where people could have actually known what actually happened, especially if you're trying to be disingenuous or dishonest? And then that's where it happens. And Stephen is the first martyr. That also happens in Jerusalem. That would have been a warning shot across the bow for the disciples if they wanted to continue on proclaiming these things. They would have realized that this is controversial, both in Jewish circles and in Gentile circles, to be proclaiming these things, to be declaring Jesus as Lord. One of the earliest confessions of Christianity was Jesus is Lord, when the society was saying Caesar is Lord. And so there were risks politically, there were risks religiously, and yet the disciples go on to proclaim these things, even to the detriment of their own lives.
So in terms of the believers and people who proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the event actually happening, they benefit from it none whatsoever. Now, typically you wouldn't die for a lie. You'd only do so for the truth, something you hold great conviction of. And at that particular time, it was the witnesses of the event that fought so hard to spread the word of Jesus Christ, which from that perspective alone gives us proof that they genuinely saw something to make them believe, despite all the punishments and persecution that will come their way from the main powers of that time, which is the Roman Empire and the Jewish rule over Jerusalem. Now, these are two main powers that you're going to go against. Do you really want to go against them with just a few of you over a lie, over something that you can't even prove? That means somewhere along the line, during that time, they experienced something genuine, something true that made them believe. Now, all of us can believe in something, but to die for it, that requires genuine conviction. See, now we're believers because we can't see. But those people back then, they were witnesses. They witnessed something divine, which spurred their conviction to spread the word of God. So we look at them now as founders of Christianity, the religion, the worldwide religion that we have come to know now. But back then, it was only a few people that believed in it. And it was those people that fought so hard to spread the word, meaning they were witnesses of the truth, a truth so profound that they were willing to die for it.
And finally, on the Bible, it also talks about things like angels and demons and stuff like that, which people point to as, well, obviously that can't be true. I mean, what do you say to people when they raise things like angels and demons?
Well, I mean, it's starting with the assumption that the supernatural doesn't exist. And I simply, I don't think that's true. I mean, there are all sorts of things that, from, say, a secular materialistic perspective, are far more of needing an explanation than the existence of supernatural beings. I mean, my friend Glenn Scrivener out in the UK, who runs an organization called Speak Life, he talks about this a lot, where, there are things that atheists and secular materialists have to account for, things like everything coming from nothing, order coming from chaos, life emerging from non-life, minds from mindless matter. Is it more of a leap in logic to believe in angels and demons, or that everything came from nothing, Piers? That order came from chaos, that life emerged from non-life, and that mind formed from mindless matter? I would say these are answers that, arguably, in terms of the topic of what we're, on the eve of Easter, the resurrection is not one more absurdity. Neither are angels or demons, but the resurrection, I think, actually is the explanation that makes sense of the supernatural world that we see talked about in, all sorts of religious perspectives. And I think that people will assume that the supernatural can't exist, and yet at the exact same time, they will, as a conscious human being in a world where we're still not really entirely sure what consciousness is, try to explain logically some of these things when, the rules of logic exist objectively, and yet they are outside of time and matter and space. And so there are obviously things that things like science and secular materialism can't account for. And I have no qualms saying that supernatural beings exist in light of this very strange supernatural world that we live in.
You know what? I completely agree. And it comes back to what I started this interview with, which was when I debate with atheists and so on who mock me for having any kind of faith in God or whatever. I say, well, look, you cannot explain to me what was there before your Big Bang. You cannot explain what was there when it was nothing. You can't even explain what nothing is. So because the human brain cannot understand that, as I said at the start, then to me, there must be super beings, entities out there. And all right, I've chosen, because I was raised as a Catholic, I've chosen to take a certain path of my belief and faith system and so on. But actually, the idea that there can't be anything supernatural when a human brain cannot explain basic things like what was there before your Big Bang or whatever, that to me is the evidence I need. Of course there must be stuff that is more powerful than humans, because otherwise we would be able to explain all that stuff, and we can't.
I think that's exactly right, Pearson. And Joe and I talked about that on my episode on the JRE, in that some people believe in the virgin birth and others believe in the virgin birth of the universe. And so a Big Bang requires a Big Banger. And so I think it's not entirely a leap to find an explanation for that, right? Something like survival of the fittest doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest. There are still explanations for origin questions that I think, we can ascribe it to, like Lawrence Krauss wants to do, nothing. But then he has to define nothing, and you find out he actually doesn't think nothing means no thing. He actually thinks it means something.
Yeah, and the other thing about atheists is they must die so unhappy, because that's it. Whereas you and I, it's just the beginning.
Well, I would want to instill hope in those atheists and say, you may think this is all there is, but it's not. And, there is so much more than just this. And to really push into some of those more metaphysical, existential questions. How does everything come from nothing? How does order come from chaos? How does life emerge from non-life? How do minds come from mindless matter? And I would really encourage them to say and look into something like the Bible, which I think ultimately gives answers. It was once said, I can't remember exactly who, that the scientists and the philosophers have been climbing the mountains only to find the theologians at the top all the way along.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy. I would say, though, theologians ain't at the top of the mountain because we're all waiting at the gate. So even though they got there first, we're still waiting for Jesus to open the gates. Philosophers, scientists, and theologians alike, we're all in the same line. None can go through except through Jesus Christ alone. So that's the most important thing. And that even though there's a lot of things that we can't see and we can't put our hands on, it doesn't mean it's not true, it's not real. Because reality and the truth goes far beyond our perceptions of it. They exist beyond us, before us and after us. So we don't have a say in determining the truth. We are but mere witnesses to it. And that's what our history is all about. And that's how we can prove historically the events of the past. Because we can't witness them. How do we know any of the things that happened in the past is real? From the events of World War II, World War I, how do we know any of these events in the past were true? Because history can be rewritten, altered, manipulated by winners and victors, with victims swept under the rug. So how can we finally find the truth in everything? And we can only do so by looking beyond what we can see, beyond what we can perceive, and looking at all the different historical evidences. And in this case, in the case of Christ, we look at the evidence from his closest people, from his disciples, from the Jewish perspective, from the Roman perspective, in order to see truly who Jesus Christ was. And from the accounts of all three, it corroborates the truth, first of all, of the existence of Jesus, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. So thank you for watching, guys. I hope this video helps you understand Christianity and Jesus a little bit better. Another great video by Wes Huff. A true blessing from God. And I hope he continues to spread the word. And I hope he continues to spread the word to many more people. Hope you like this video. I'm Thirdy, helping you see life in plain sight. See you on the next one. Peace.